Judge Harold Whitman thought he was sentencing another reckless young man until the defendant began dismantling the case like a seasoned attorney. Inside the Chicago County Courthouse, the air felt thick, almost suffocating. Rows of spectators filled the gallery, murmuring as they watched the scene unfold. At the defense table stood Malcolm Reid, a 20-year-old college student, hands in his pockets, chin lifted just enough to show he wasn't afraid. He had been charged with grand theft auto and evading arrest, serious charges. But from the way Judge Whitman looked at him, it was clear the real trial had nothing to do with the law. Whitman leaned back in his chair, fingers drumming lazily against his desk. He peered down at Malcolm over the rim of his glasses, his lips twisting into something between a smirk and a sneer. "You think you're some kind of legal expert?" he asked, voice laced with dry amusement. "This isn't a debate club, son." A few chuckles rippled through the courtroom, the bailiff, the stenographer, even the prosecutor. They were all in on the joke. But Malcolm didn't flinch. He wasn't laughing. He had spent years preparing for this, not this exact moment, but something like it. He never expected to stand here as a defendant, but he knew courtrooms like the back of his hand. While other kids memorized basketball stats, he memorized case law. While his friends played video games, he played mock trials in his head, arguing cases against himself. His mother, Evelyn Reid, had worked as a paralegal for over 25 years, and Malcolm grew up listening to the stories she brought home, how prosecutors cut corners, how judges played favorites, how some defense attorneys barely tried. By the time he was 16, he could break down a trial better than most law students. But none of that mattered to Judge Whitman. To him, Malcolm was just another young man in trouble. The judge sighed, flipping open the case file. "Let's make this quick. I have a tea time at 3. Laughter rippled through the courtroom again. But this time, something shifted. Malcolm's lips curled into a faint, almost imperceptible smirk. Whitman had just made his first mistake. But the courtroom hadn't noticed yet. The prosecutor, Jonathan Pierce, rose from his seat with the air of a man who had already won. His suit was crisp, his tie perfectly knotted, his voice brimming with the confidence of someone who had given this speech 100 times before. "Your Honor, the state will prove beyond a shadow of a doubt that the defendant, Malcolm Reid, was caught red-handed in a stolen vehicle, a 2023 Tesla Model S, reported missing just hours before his arrest. Officers pursued him through downtown, where he allegedly attempted to flee before being apprehended. His fingerprints were found on the steering wheel. The prosecution submits that the evidence speaks for itself." The words landed with weight. The gallery whispered among themselves. On the surface, it sounded damning. A stolen car, a chase, an arrest. Judge Whitman glanced at Malcolm over the rim of his glasses. "Go on." Pierce walked toward the jury box, his polished shoes clicking against the floor. "The defense may try to convince you that this was all a misunderstanding, that Mr. Reid is some unfortunate victim of circumstance." He turned, locking eyes with Malcolm for the first time. "But let's be honest. What kind of victim runs from the police?" The tension thickened. Whitman leaned forward, resting his chin on his hand. Malcolm didn't blink. Pierce continued, flipping through his papers. "Your Honor, I have here the testimony of Officer Brian Martinez, who personally witnessed the defendant behind the wheel before he attempted to flee. The car was confirmed stolen. The arrest was made by the book." Judge Whitman exhaled through his nose. "Sounds straightforward to me." For most people in the room, it probably did. But Malcolm had spent too many years studying trials not to see the cracks. Still, he stayed silent, watching, waiting. Whitman tapped his gavel lightly. "All right, let's hear the defense's response." He turned to Malcolm's court-appointed lawyer, Susan Caldwell, who had barely spoken since stepping into the courtroom. She stood, shifting nervously. "Your Honor, my client—" Malcolm placed a hand on her arm. A silent request. She hesitated, then sat back down. And for the first time, Malcolm spoke. I'll be representing myself, Your Honor. The room went completely silent. Judge Whitman's eyebrows shot up. You'll what? Malcolm's voice was calm, steady. I'll be defending myself. A murmur spread through the courtroom. The bailiff's eyebrows shot up. Pierce's smirk faltered, just for a second, before he let out a sharp laugh. This should be interesting. But no one was laughing when Malcolm took his first step forward, because everything was about to change. The weight of the courtroom settled around him as he adjusted his stance, hands still in his pockets. He let the silence stretch just a little longer, long enough to make them uncomfortable. Then, finally, he spoke. Your Honor, before I begin, I'd like to confirm something with the prosecution. Pierce crossed his arms. Go ahead. Malcolm took a slow step forward. You said, Officer Brian Martinez personally saw me behind the wheel before I was arrested, correct? Pierce exhaled sharply, already bored. That's right. And that testimony is written in his report? Of course it is. Malcolm nodded, then turned to Judge Whitman. Your Honor, I move to dismiss that testimony as evidence. Whitman squinted. On what grounds? Malcolm pulled his hands from his pockets for the first time and gestured toward the prosecution's table. Because Officer Martinez never saw me in that car. In fact, he wasn't even on duty when the chase began. A flicker of confusion crossed Pierce's face. What are you talking about? Malcolm took another step forward. Your Honor, if the court allows me, I'd like to submit a request to verify Officer Martinez's GPS logs from that night. If his report says he witnessed me in the vehicle, then it should match his location history. But he let the word hang in the air. I have a feeling it won't. The murmurs in the gallery grew louder. Judge Whitman frowned, glancing toward Pierce. Pierce cleared his throat, his jaw tightening. That report was filed by an officer of the law, Your Honor. Are we really going to take the word of a defendant over a trained professional? Malcolm gave a small, almost casual shrug. If the officer was where he claimed to be, then the GPS data will prove it. But if he wasn't, he let the sentence trail off. Judge Whitman studied him for a long moment, then turned to Pierce. Does the prosecution have any issue with verifying the officer's GPS logs? Pierce hesitated. The pause was just long enough. The jury noticed. The gallery noticed. And, most importantly, the judge noticed. Malcolm took a quiet breath. He had spent years watching trials, studying prosecutors, analyzing their tactics, the way they played the system. And one thing he knew for certain. If Pierce was confident in his case, he wouldn't be stalling. Judge Whitman sighed, rubbing his temple. Pierce finally shook his head. No objections, Your Honor. But the shift had already begun. For the first time, the courtroom wasn't laughing anymore. The courtroom was silent, but the tension was loud. Pierce shuffled his papers, his polished confidence cracking around the edges. Your Honor, while we wait for the GPS records, the fact remains that the defendant's fingerprints were found on the steering wheel of the stolen vehicle. Malcolm nodded, his face unreadable. That's true. He took a step forward. But let's talk about that evidence for a second. Judge Whitman raised an eyebrow, gesturing for him to continue. Malcolm turned to the jury, making eye contact with each one of them. The prosecution wants you to believe that finding my fingerprints in a car means I stole it. That's the story they're selling. But let's think about this logically. He took a deep breath, keeping his tone calm and controlled. Let's say you walk into a department store and try on a jacket. You put your hands in the pockets, maybe zip it up, then put it back on the rack and walk out. A few hours later, someone shoplifts that jacket. Would the fact that your fingerprints are on it mean you stole it? A few jurors exchanged glances. Someone in the gallery muttered under their breath. Malcolm didn't give them time to recover. The car in question was parked outside a gas station hours before the alleged theft. I was inside that store with 3. Pierce's jaw tightened. Malcolm nodded, like that was all he needed to hear. Interesting. Judge Whitman sighed, rubbing his temple. It was the look of a man realizing this case wasn't the easy win he had assumed it would be. But Malcolm wasn't done yet. Because the next thing he was about to say, it would change everything. Malcolm Reid exhaled slowly, his eyes steady as he looked at the jury. I leaned against the car. I even opened the door because it was already unlocked. I didn't think much of it. Didn't take the car, didn't drive it, didn't steal anything from inside, just a dumb moment of curiosity. He let the words settle. The courtroom was silent, tension thickening in the air. Then, in a voice sharp as a scalpel, he asked, "Does touching something make you a criminal?" Jonathan Pierce, the prosecutor, cleared his throat. He flipped through his notes, searching for something, anything, to regain control. Malcolm wasn't finished. And while we're on the topic, let's talk about how that fingerprint analysis was done. He turned to Judge Harold Whitman, whose expression remained unreadable. Your Honor, was the forensic specialist from this case subpoenaed to testify? Whitman blinked, caught off guard by the question. He glanced at Pierce. The prosecutor hesitated, then reluctantly admitted, "No." Malcolm pressed his lips together. "So, let me get this straight. The state is using forensic evidence to try and convict me, but they didn't think it was necessary to bring in the actual specialist who processed that evidence? No chance for me to cross-examine, ask about the chain of custody, or challenge the accuracy of the analysis?" Pierce's jaw tightened. Malcolm nodded, as if that was all he needed to hear. "Interesting." Judge Whitman sighed, pinching the bridge of his nose. He had assumed this case would be an easy conviction. He was beginning to realize otherwise. But Malcolm wasn't done yet, because the next thing he was about to say, it would change everything. Malcolm took a slow step forward, his voice steady but firm. "Your Honor, I'd like to enter into evidence an official statement from the owner of the vehicle." Whitman frowned. "The owner?" Malcolm nodded. "Yes, Mr. Alan Whitaker, the registered owner of the stolen Tesla, provided a statement to the police. For some reason, it was never submitted in the prosecution's filings." He turned to Pierce. "Do you recall what Mr. Whitaker told officers the night his car was reported stolen?" Pierce clenched his jaw. He knew exactly what was coming. Malcolm didn't wait for an answer. Instead, he pulled out a printed transcript from his file and read aloud. "I left my car running when I ran inside the gas station. Some kid must have jumped in and taken off, but it wasn't the guy you arrested. I saw the kid, and he was white." A collective gasp rippled through the courtroom. Malcolm held the paper up. "This is from the original police report, the same report the prosecution conveniently never mentioned." He turned back to Judge Whitman. "The arresting officer admitted this in his testimony. The prosecution ignored it. And yet they want this jury to believe that I, someone who doesn't even match the description of the real thief, am guilty beyond a reasonable doubt?" Pierce stepped forward, scrambling. "Your Honor, this is irrelevant. The defendant was caught in possession of the vehicle." But Malcolm shook his head. "No, I wasn't." His voice didn't rise, but it cut through the courtroom with sharp precision. "I was arrested blocks away from where the vehicle was abandoned, walking home after getting snacks with my friends. I wasn't in the car. I wasn't near the car. I wasn't running from anything." He turned to the jury, his voice unwavering. "The only thing tying me to this case is bad police work and assumptions." Judge Whitman let out a slow breath, rubbing his temple. The case was unraveling fast, and everyone knew it. Malcolm faced the jury, his voice firm but calm. "The real suspect got away that night. The officers found a black kid in the same general area and decided that was close enough. That's what this case is really about." Silence. Judge Whitman cleared his throat and adjusted his glasses. "Does the prosecution have anything further?" Pierce was stiff, his face flushed. "No, Your Honor." Whitman exhaled. He looked at Malcolm for a long time, then glanced at the jury. Finally, he leaned forward and spoke the words that would stay with everyone in that room. "Case dismissed." A beat of stunned silence. Then, chaos. Half the courtroom erupted, some in disbelief, some in quiet relief. The gallery stirred, reporters scribbling in their notebooks. Malcolm didn't move right away. He let the moment settle, let the reality sink in for everyone. Judge Whitman, still gripping his gavel, looked at Malcolm with an unreadable expression. There was something in his eyes that hadn't been there before. Recognition. Maybe even regret. Malcolm met his gaze, then turned to leave. But just as he reached the door, the judge spoke again. Mr. Reid, Malcolm stopped but didn't turn. Whitman hesitated, then finally said, "You should consider law school." Malcolm smirked. He didn't need to consider it. He was already on his way. "Mr. Reid." Malcolm stopped but didn't turn. Judge Whitman hesitated, then finally said, "You should consider law school." A smirk tugged at Malcolm's lips. He didn't need to consider it. He was already on his way. Outside the Chicago County Courthouse, the air buzzed with voices. Reporters swarmed the steps, their cameras flashing, microphones thrust forward like weapons. "Malcolm, did you know the judge would dismiss the case? What are you going to do next? How does it feel to outmaneuver a seasoned prosecutor?" Malcolm pulled his hoodie over his head, ignoring the questions. He wasn't interested in the spectacle. This wasn't about proving how smart he was. It was about something bigger. At the bottom of the steps, his mother, Evelyn Reid, was waiting. Her arms were crossed, her expression unreadable. For a long moment, she just looked at him. Then, finally, she shook her head and let out a breath. "Boy, you scared me half to death." Malcolm chuckled, scratching the back of his head. "Had to take a risk, Ma." She stared at him a second longer, then pulled him into a tight hug. "You always were the stubborn one." The cameras kept flashing, but Malcolm wasn't paying attention anymore. Across the street, standing beside his car, Judge Whitman watched. His posture was different now. The arrogance was gone. His expression wasn't amused anymore. It was something else, something closer to reflection. He hadn't expected this case to be anything more than routine. Just another day, another defendant, another guilty plea. But now, he knew he'd remember this one, because Malcolm had done something most people never could. He made the system look at itself. And, for once, it blinked first. Here's the lesson we should learn. How many other cases had gone this way? How many people had been convicted, not because of evidence, but because of bias, shortcuts, and a system that cared more about closing cases than finding the truth? Malcolm had the knowledge to fight back. But what about the ones who didn't? This wasn't just about one case. It was about all of them. He knew what he had to do next. This courtroom wouldn't be the last one he stood in. But next time, he wouldn't be the defendant. He'd be the attorney. And when that day came, he wouldn't be the only one. If this story made you think, even for a second, share it. The justice system is built on laws, but it's run by people. And people can change, but only if we make them. So hit that like button, subscribe for more stories that matter, and let's keep the conversation going. Because next time, it might not be Malcolm. It might be someone you know.